Hey yo everyone! The video game industry is an incredibly cutthroat business, as last week's Microsoft layoffs harshly reminded us. Gamers are always looking for that next big thing, so if you're just playing it safe and not really innovating, then you're gonna get left behind. Well, usually anyway. I suppose there are some exceptions. In order for these long-lasting franchises to find continuous success, they've had to re-examine themselves and find ways to truly evolve while staying true to what gave them success in the first place. So, today I've compiled a list of 10 video game franchises that have reinvented themselves, mostly for the better. I could only squeeze 10 entries into this list, but if you have some other recommendations, mention them below in the comments. Maybe we'll do a part 2. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. We're getting closer to our 1,000 sub goal. Alright, let's get it. Alrighty, at number 10, we gotta talk about Super Mario 64. Not only is Super Mario 64 Mario's first appearance in 3D, but it's also considered one of the most influential video games of all time. It clearly laid a blueprint for modern Mario masterpieces, such as Odyssey, but it also trailblazed how almost all 3D video games would play for generations to come. Up until this point, all of Mario's adventures had been in a two-dimensional format, but when Nintendo's first 3D console, the Nintendo 64, was released in the summer of 1996, it brought Mario along with it. Instead of being a linear side-scroller, Super Mario 64 opened up the game with large areas filled with secrets, puzzles, and enemies to conquer. This shift in focus had gamers going from a traditional platformer to a 3D action exploration game. Shigeru Miyamoto first came up with the concept after working on Star Fox for the SNES. He wanted to create a brand new iteration of Mario, something that would completely flip the franchise on its head. So after months of continuous tinkering, his development team came up with the virtual camera, a way for players to control the perspective in a 3D space. At the time, there was nothing quite like this, and I find it funny that they embodied the virtual camera as a Lakitu to help visualize the concept for fans. Sounds silly in 2025, I know, but this is how revolutionary these camera controls were. Anyway, after figuring out the virtual camera, the studio did a bunch of other stuff to make the jump to 3D as seamless as possible for Mario. Cutting edge tech to design sprites, plenty of open space to learn the new controls, and a new HP health mechanic that would be more forgiving than previous Mario games. Super Mario 64 is a triumph in showcasing how to translate a 2D platformer to a 3D space. I know the game hasn't exactly aged the best since then, but this truly was a defining moment for not only Mario, but the gaming industry as a whole. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Kingdom Hearts, Spyro, and Banjo-Kazooie have all credited the game as an inspiration to some extent. Heck, even Dan Houser, one of the founders of Rockstar and the Grand Theft Auto franchise, has said that anyone who makes 3D games who says they've not borrowed something from Super Mario 64 is lying. So yeah, to say this game reinvented its franchise would be an understatement. Next up at number 9, I want to talk about Assassin's Creed, specifically Assassin's Creed Origins. In 2017, the Assassin's Creed franchise was stuck in a bit of a rut. Unity was a technical disaster, and Syndicate had one of the worst launches in the franchise's history. Something needed to be done, so Ubisoft Montreal was granted an extra year of development for their next Assassin's Creed game, and they really made the most of it. Assassin's Creed Origins took a pretty drastic turn from its predecessors. Where previous games focused heavily on the stealth action aspect, Origins shifted the gameplay to a more RPG-style open world. Seriously, the map here is massive. Besides the huge, sprawling world to explore, Origins also introduced a new hitbox combat system and, of course, those RPG elements we mentioned earlier, such as leveling up, skill points, and special abilities. Despite the fact that this was a pretty big deviation from the original Assassin's Creed gameplay, Origins was received incredibly well, maybe even a bit too well. Ubisoft decided that this would be the new template for Assassin's Creed games moving forward because Odyssey, the follow-up in this new RPG-style era, doubled down on those changes. An even bigger open world with tons of customization for the players to choose from. But as we learned with the third entry in this new trilogy, Valhalla, bigger isn't always better. While these massive RPGs are filled with content, quantity doesn't necessarily equate to quality. In my opinion, Assassin's Creed Valhalla was a bit too much. The story was way too drawn out, the map was too bloated, and the story just didn't really feel as impactful as the previous two. It's not a bad game by any means, no, but Valhalla felt the most distant from what the original Assassin's Creed franchise was. Thankfully, Assassin's Creed Shadows is a nice little course correction that feels more on par with Origins and Odyssey than Valhalla. So although the Assassin's Creed franchise is no longer that story-driven, mostly linear single-player adventure, it still has that AC feel from the old games that has managed to evolve into something fresh for the fans. Hopefully this trend can continue and the devs at Ubisoft can refine the gameplay even more to find that perfect balance between that old school classic Assassin's Creed formula and the new open world RPG mechanics. Next up at number 8, let's revisit Metroid Prime. Originally released back in 2002, Metroid Prime is a landmark title and still considered one of the greatest games ever to be made. With Metroid Prime, Nintendo and Retro Studios were able to seamlessly transition from 2D Metroidvanias to a 3D first-person shooter, something that a lot of people were reluctant on. You see, Metroid was one of the best when it came to 2D exploration games. After all, it's 50% responsible for the Metroidvania genre, but just because the game had critical and commercial success in 2D gaming didn't mean it would translate well into a 3D space. In fact, Nintendo wanted to try and build a 3D Metroid game for the Nintendo 64, but ended up canceling it after coming to the conclusion that they couldn't match the quality of Super Metroid. It wasn't until Shigeru Miyamoto visited Retro Studios in Austin, Texas that the first 3D Metroid game would begin development. Miyamoto was impressed by their proprietary first-person shooter engine and hired Retro to build Metroid Prime. It was a pretty big collaboration, with Nintendo creating the soundtrack, Retro handling the art and gameplay, and both companies exchanging ideas for the overall design. Originally, the game was going to be in third person, but after game testing, Miyamoto said the game needed to be in first person to really make the most of that Metroid feeling, a feeling that puts exploration and puzzle solving above shooting and action. In Nintendo's own words, they wanted Metroid Prime to not be a first-person shooter, but instead a first-person adventure. And yeah, I'd say they got what they asked for. The game was a tremendous success and is cited as one of the most important titles in video game history. Retro would go on to do 2 more games in the franchise before eventually being bought out by Xbox, but that didn't stop Nintendo from signing a contract that would bring them back for Metroid Prime 4 after the original studio failed to meet Nintendo's expectations for the Prime franchise. And with the recent Metroid Prime remaster, it's clear as to why the original Prime was and continues to be a triumph of excellent game development. Now at number 7, I want to take a look back at Metal Gear Solid. Fun fact, Hideo Kojima decided to name it Metal Gear Solid instead of Metal Gear 3 because the first couple of games in the franchise weren't exactly blockbusters and didn't even release in America. Plus, just like Metroid Prime, Metal Gear Solid would be the first game in the franchise to transition from 2D to 3D gameplay. Well, kind of. The game is kind of played like a 2D game with the camera set up above Snake, like the 2D originals, but the sprites used are 3D, and you have the ability to switch to a first-person perspective in certain instances. It's kind of confusing, but yeah, this is basically a 3D game for all intents and purposes. Anyway, Kojima wanted Metal Gear Solid to be the game that would really define the franchise. Instead of using an older Solid Snake like previous entries, Kojima opted for a younger version that would have more appeal to the audience. Instead of copying and pasting different environmental assets, the devs made everything with excruciating detail, such as designing each desk differently. I mean, Kojima even worked with SWAT teams and weapon experts to really nail the immersiveness of the game. He also made a large emphasis on the game feeling cinematic, and you certainly see that in the quality of the cutscenes sprinkled throughout the game. This incredible attention to detail led Metal Gear Solid to become one of the best rated games of all time, and is often credited for popularizing the stealth strategy genre as well as in-engine cutscenes. This shift in design might not have been a complete 180 from the first 2 games in the series, but Metal Gear Solid is certainly a reinvention of the Metal Gear franchise. Down to number 6, let's talk about Helldivers 2. Admittedly, this game isn't too different from the first one, but I want to talk about it anyway because I'm hyped for the Xbox port. God, I love this game. The original Helldivers was a top-down shooter where you and 3 buddies would go on procedurally generated missions in the name of Super Earth. The original game had stratagems and friendly fire just like the sequel, but it also focused more on stealth gameplay as the enemy AI could be quite challenging at times. It rated pretty well with critics and fans alike, but the commercial success wasn't anything too crazy with just over 4 million lifetime sales. Its sequel, the adequately named Helldivers 2, took the themes from the original game and went even crazier. More bugs, more robots, more action, more humor. It's a freaking great time. The gameplay shifted from a top-down shooter to a third-person action shooter, and this was easily the best decision made by the devs. The game gets this instant sort of cinematic feel to the gameplay where you're constantly running and gunning and seeing explosions all over the place with incredible particle effects. It's amazing, honestly. Stratagems are back, as well as the online co-op, and the sequel even brought in difficulty settings with individual missions so you can switch up your playthroughs. Also, those stratagems are brought in using this little mini game where you have to execute a certain button sequence in order to call them in. Almost kind of like cheat codes. Helldivers 2 also went the live service route with battle passes and such included with each new major update, but in my opinion, it's not as egregious as some of the other live service games out there. All of these changes were met with open arms as Helldivers 2 went viral last year, topping over 15 million copies sold to date and a ton of awards and nominations to go along with it. So yeah, maybe not the most drastic change out there, but these changes transformed Helldivers from a pretty niche fanbase into a live service juggernaut basically overnight. Down to our top 5, let's talk Fallout 3. Fallout 3 was the first Fallout game developed by Bethesda after they acquired the rights from Interplay Entertainment back in 2007. Originally, the game was supposed to be a partnership with Interplay Entertainment for Bethesda to develop a couple of Fallout games, but Todd Howard and the crew must have really liked the IP because they ended up buying it from Interplay for just under $6 million. Under Bethesda, Fallout took a pretty momentous shift in style. Instead of continuing the 2D turn-based style of gameplay, Fallout 3 opened up the franchise to a sprawling open world with 3D graphics and real-time combat. Todd Howard wanted the game to still pay respect to the original turn-based system though, so Bethesda came up with the VAT system, which basically gave the combat this slow-mo cinematic element where a player could strategically choose where to attack their enemy. Since this was the first time a Fallout game would be played in 3D and in scope much larger than the previous entries, Bethesda had to find a way to make the game still feel as if you were struggling to survive in an endless wasteland. Because of the 3D camera system, players could initially see the entirety of the map from almost any location, which contradicted the apocalyptic wasteland the devs were looking for. To remedy this, they spread key points of interest out all over the map to make the world feel bigger than what it actually was. Then they sprinkled in some random encounters in the open world to really make the environment feel alive. It seems like pretty standard open world stuff these days, but back then, this was a real game changer. Fallout 3 also kept all of the RPG elements that made the original game so popular, such as leveling up character attributes, a karma system, companions, and tons of recorded dialogue. In a lot of ways, it feels like the perfect successor to Fallout 2, but the changes made it undeniably a reinvention of the series. Now at number 4, I want to talk about God of War. The 2018 iteration of God of War was one of the truest reinventions of a franchise. Up until this point, Kratos and the God of War series focused exclusively on the Greek pantheon. I'm sure you're already aware, but the classic games were much more action-oriented and featured Kratos hunting down and killing the Greek gods. The game used a fixed camera angle and was mostly a linear experience. With the 2018 entry, fans were greeted with an older, more experienced Kratos who now has a young son named Atreus. The sequel games, now set in the Norse mythology instead of Greek, has a focus set more on adventure rather than action, at least compared to the original trilogy. Instead of the game being linear, it has more of an open level feeling where Kratos can go to specific areas and explore relatively freely. This new iteration of God of War also goes for a pretty novel cinematic feel where the camera is now dynamic and be controlled by the player. The point of view is that close-up third-person perspective that PlayStation games have basically mastered at this point. But like I mentioned earlier, the story this time around is much more focused around adventure rather than the brutal, raw action of the first games. The themes are far more mature in my opinion, and it shows a real growth in Kratos as a character and a father. The developers also did some magic behind the scenes to make the game appear as one constant shot from start to finish. Yes, there are still cutscenes and loading times, but they are disguised by seamless cinematic transitions and having Kratos sneak through a wall or something. And lastly, the game introduces some RPG elements where Kratos has some more weapon variety, cosmetics, and even a skill tree. I mean, to me, God of War 2018 is one of the best examples out there of a game reinventing itself successfully. They kept the characters and the lore that everyone came to love with the original franchise and expanded on it, introducing an entirely new pantheon with an entirely new gameplay system. I can't wait to see what Santa Monica Studios does next, whether that's sticking with this style of game, going back to the classic formula, or maybe even giving us something else entirely. Down to our top 3, let's talk about Resident Evil 7. Is it too far of a stretch to say this game saved the Resident Evil franchise? Probably, but I'm gonna roll with it anyway for dramatic effect. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard launched when the franchise was going through an identity crisis of sorts. Resident Evil 5 and 6 were decent, but they weren't quite the Resident Evil experience fans were looking for. The original trilogy of games were heavily focused on the survival horror genre, utilizing a fixed camera angle and relying on the feeling of desperation by limiting supplies and crafting a suffocating atmosphere to really get the blood pumping. Then when Resident Evil 4 released, the franchise took a turn to a more action horror genre. A dynamic third-person camera, a badass protagonist in Leon, and the utilization of QuickTime events. All of these additions were welcomed with critical and commercial success, as Resident Evil 4 is considered one of the greatest games ever. Then Resident Evil 5 and 6 took that action and leaned even more into it, unfortunately to the detriment of the games. Then came along Resident Evil 7. Capcom decided it was time to go back to its roots and went all in on the survival horror aspect. For the first time in the franchise, the camera was locked into a first-person point of view. The story takes place entirely on a southern plantation that has become home to a monstrous family with a mysterious illness. Everything about this game is unsettling. The first-person perspective makes the already creepy house feel even more claustrophobic. You always have this sense of dread while exploring, and honestly, the environmental design is pretty disgusting. It's awesome. There were also additions to the gameplay mechanics, such as introducing a crouching feature that would allow Ethan, the protagonist, to move through small areas or sneak around prowling enemies. The new gameplay systems are great, and the choice to make Ethan basically a civilian with no real weapons training makes the combat feel even more raw and desperate. It was a pretty big risk at the time for Capcom to go first-person survival horror, but that risk more than paid off. They absolutely nailed every aspect of what makes a great Resident Evil game so great, even if it doesn't look like a classic Resident Evil entry. This new style also continued on with the sequel, Resident Evil Village, and it appears as if Requiem, the 9th entry in the franchise, is leaning even further into the desperate survival horror genre. Only time will tell if the series will go through another shakeup, but for now, Resident Evil 7 can brag about its transformational entry into a legendary franchise. Now at number 2, I got Grand Theft Auto 3. Grand Theft Auto 3 was essentially the birthplace for modern GTA games. It was the first 3D game in the series, leaving behind the 2D over-the-top perspective that the first two games had. The previous GTA, Grand Theft Auto 2, used a level system that basically made the game linear. Yes, the open world aspect was still kinda there, but the player's objective was to complete a series of levels in order to unlock the next stage. Each level would give you points for completing main objectives and from side stuff, such as stealing and destroying vehicles, which could then be used for upgrades and equipment. GTA 3 then flipped all of that on its head by opening up the game, allowing the player to roam the open world at their own pace. The map was now dotted with optional side missions that could be completed in any order. There were also new mini-games such as the taxi cab activity and would often come with their own special rewards. With the 3D elements in place, the devs introduced a ton of now GTA staples: the non-linear mission structure, auto-aim, the ability to commit drive-bys, ragdoll physics, off-road driving, and iconic NPCs that make the world more memorable. All of a sudden, the Grand Theft Auto franchise went from a linear 2D top-down action-adventure shooter to a 3D open world full of sophisticated physics and groundbreaking mission variety hosted by memorable NPCs. Sure, it's not the best Grand Theft Auto ever, but it's the one that forged the path for every GTA game that followed. Who knows where the franchise, or heck, even all of gaming, would be today without the innovation and success of Grand Theft Auto 3. Now finally, at number 1, let's talk about The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. I was really torn between Breath of the Wild and Ocarina of Time, but ultimately ended up choosing the former. Breath of the Wild is one of the best reinventions of a legendary franchise, while Ocarina of Time is a reinvention of video games almost entirely. So yeah, while Ocarina might have made a larger impact on video games in general, Breath of the Wild is a better fit for this specific video's topic. So let's talk about it. I'm sure at this point most of you are familiar with Breath of the Wild. It's reviewed as one of the greatest games ever to be developed. While older Legend of Zelda games were still focused on that sense of adventure, they were limited by their linear story progression. Yes, there were open world areas and tons of secrets and puzzles to make you feel like a true adventurer, but you never really had complete freedom. Breath of the Wild, however, changes all of that. After you beat the short-ish tutorial, you're given all of the tools you need to explore Hyrule at your own leisure. The Sheikah Slate introduces some mind-bending physics that allow the player unprecedented freedom when it comes to puzzle solving and exploration. And as for that exploration, to say it redefined the term open world would be an understatement. Wherever you look, there will be something new to check out. You see that mountain over there? That's not a map boundary. You can scale it. That desert in the distance, it's yours to conquer. That huge ravine that splits up the map, you can cross it, dive into it, or avoid it completely. Everything you see is reachable in one way or another. Seriously, the climbing and paragliding system allows Link to travel virtually anywhere, finding secrets in every nook and cranny the massive open world has to offer. Yeah, some of the introductions to the game weren't received as well, such as how rain affects climbing or the weapon degradation system, but the stuff it does do well, it's incredible. A new health system where Link can concoct an ungodly variety of meals and elixirs to heal and buff himself, a stamina wheel that balances Link's unprecedented freedom of movement, the Sheikah rune abilities that can be used however the player chooses to solve puzzles, defeat enemies, or alter the environment, and just the overall creative decision to let the player decide how to progress through the game. It's not just an open world, it's an open experience. You are taught everything you need to know about the game within the tutorial, and from there, the game says, alright, you're on your own now. Go explore, go experiment, go discover wacky, creative ways to immerse yourself into this content-rich world of Hyrule. Tears of the Kingdom followed up as a sequel and expanded on these principles, but man, nothing compares to that sense of wonder and freedom that Breath of the Wild first introduced to us. But that's enough of my rambling. Sorry for the super duper pooper long video this week. I've been sitting on this one for a while and wanted to get it out there. Hopefully you guys found this video as interesting as I did making it. I'd love to hear from you. What franchise do you think had the most drastic reinvention? Which franchises did I miss? Would you like to see a part 2? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down below in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It means a lot. I appreciate you guys as always, and I'll catch you in the next one.